Tonight, we embark on a journey through the extraordinary life of Jeanne d'Arc, the young French heroine whose courage, faith, and leadership inspired a nation in the midst of its darkest hour. From the humble beginnings of a peasant girl in the remote village of Domremy, to her rise as a military commander who would crown a king and alter the trajectory of the 100 Years' War, Joan's story is one of divine visions, unwavering conviction, and ultimate sacrifice. Her legacy continues to shine through centuries of war, faith, and resistance. Joan's martyrdom and subsequent canonization reflect a powerful story of conviction and strength that resonates across cultures and generations. As we delve into her incredible journey, we'll explore not just the historical facts, but the profound human story of a young woman who believed so deeply in her mission that she was willing to die for it. Chapter 1. The Village of Domremy, a world apart before she became a warrior, a symbol, and a saint. Joan of Arc was simply a child in a quiet corner of the world, a place so small that most maps didn't even bother marking it. The village was called Domremy, nestled in the gentle valleys of northeastern France, where the Meuse River carved its way through rolling hills and fertile farmland. Domremy was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where the rhythm of life was dictated not by the affairs of kings and courts, but by the eternal cycle of seasons. Rolling hills stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with sheep and thatched-roof cottages that seemed to grow organically from the earth itself. The seasons shaped daily life with their ancient cadence. In spring, the rivers sang with melted snow, rushing toward distant seas. In summer, fields of barley swayed like golden oceans under the warm sun. In winter, snow blanketed the earth in a silence so profound it seemed to muffle even thought itself. It was in this peaceful setting that Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan as history would know her, was born sometime around 1412. The exact date remains lost to time, as was common for peasant children in that era, but most historians place her birth in the winter months, when the world lay dormant beneath its blanket of snow. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, were simple farmers who embodied the virtues of their rural existence. They didn't possess wealth in the way nobles or merchants might understand it, but they had something perhaps more valuable: land, faith, and 5 children to carry on their legacy. Jacques was known throughout the village as a man of integrity, steady and hard-working, who served not only as a farmer but as a minor village official, helping to settle disputes and maintain order in their small community. Isabelle, Joan's mother, was a woman of deep religious conviction, whose faith would profoundly shape her daughter's spiritual development. She was known for her kindness to strangers, her devotion to prayer, and her ability to find hope, even in the darkest of times. From her, Joan would inherit not only her spiritual intensity, but also her remarkable compassion for those who suffered. Joan was the youngest of the 5 children, and from her earliest years, she displayed qualities that set her apart from her siblings and peers. She wasn't loud or boisterous like many children her age. Instead, she possessed an inner quietude that seemed almost otherworldly. While other children played games or explored the countryside, Joan found herself drawn to prayer and contemplation. The villagers of Domremy noticed this unusual child who, barely out of infancy, would slip quietly into the village church and kneel in silence for hours. Her eyes would close in deep concentration, and her lips would move in gentle whispers that only God could hear. There was something about her demeanor, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or an awareness that seemed to extend beyond her years, that made even the adults pause and wonder. The church of Saint Remy, from which the village took its name, became Joan's sanctuary. Built of local stone and timber, it was a modest structure that reflected the simple faith of its congregation. Here, surrounded by flickering candles and the soft murmur of prayers, Joan felt most at home. She would often be found kneeling before the altar, her small hands clasped in prayer, her face turned upward as if listening for something the rest of the world couldn't hear. But Joan's spiritual nature didn't make her otherworldly in the sense of being disconnected from daily life. On the contrary, she threw herself into the work of the household with the same intensity she brought to prayer. She helped her mother with cooking and cleaning, learned to spin wool and weave cloth, and assisted with the countless chores that sustained rural life. Her hands, though young, quickly became skilled at the practical tasks that would serve her well throughout her life. The D'Arc family's home was typical of prosperous peasant dwellings of the time, built from local timber and stone, with a thatched roof that kept out the rain and snow. It consisted of a main room where the family gathered for meals and evening conversations, a smaller chamber where the parents slept, and a loft where the children shared sleeping quarters. The house was furnished simply but comfortably, with sturdy wooden furniture crafted by local artisans and textiles woven by the women of the household. Outside, the family maintained a small garden where they grew vegetables for their own consumption, and Jacques worked several plots of land where he cultivated grain and raised livestock. The family owned sheep, cattle, and chickens, making them relatively prosperous by the standards of their community. This modest prosperity would later prove significant when Joan needed resources to begin her mission. Life in Domremy followed the ancient rhythms of agricultural communities. The day began with the rooster's call at dawn, when the family would rise and begin their daily tasks. Joan would help her mother prepare breakfast, usually bread, cheese, and perhaps some preserved meat before the family gathered for morning prayers. After breakfast, each family member would disperse to their assigned tasks, Jacques to his fields, Isabelle to her household duties, and the children to whatever work was appropriate for their age and abilities. Joan's education, like that of most peasant children, was primarily practical and spiritual rather than academic. She couldn't read or write, which was not unusual for someone of her social class, but this didn't mean she was unintelligent or uninformed. Instead, her education came through listening to the stories told by traveling priests, to the scriptures read during Mass, to the oral traditions passed down through generations of villagers. The church played a central role in this educational process. During Mass, Joan would listen intently as the priest read from the Bible, memorizing prayers and absorbing the stories of saints who had performed miraculous deeds. She learned about Saint Michael the Archangel, who had defeated Satan in cosmic battle, Saint Margaret of Antioch, who had remained steadfast in her faith despite persecution, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who had debated philosophers and died for her beliefs. These stories would later prove prophetic, as Joan would claim that these very saints had appeared to her with divine messages. The village of Domremy itself was a microcosm of medieval French society. It contained perhaps 100 souls, all of whom knew each other intimately. There was the priest, Father Minute, who served not only as spiritual guide, but as one of the few literate members of the community. There were craftsmen, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a miller who provided essential services to the farming community. There were other farming families, some more prosperous than others, but all bound together by the shared challenges and rhythms of rural life. Despite its remote location, Domremy was not entirely isolated from the broader currents of French history. The village lay in the Duchy of Bar, which was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire but culturally and politically aligned with France. This borderland location meant that the inhabitants of Domremy were acutely aware of the larger conflicts that were reshaping their world. That the 100 Years' War, which had been raging since 1337, cast a long shadow over daily life even in this remote village. Though the actual fighting rarely reached Domremy, its effects were felt in countless ways. Taxes increased to fund military campaigns, young men were conscripted into armies, and refugees from devastated regions sometimes passed through, bringing with them tales of horror and destruction. Joan grew up hearing these stories of war and suffering, and they made a deep impression on her sensitive nature. She would later recall how the accounts of burned villages and murdered innocents had troubled her sleep and filled her with a burning desire to somehow help her suffering countrymen. This early exposure to the realities of war would profoundly shape her later mission. The France of Joan's childhood was not the unified nation we know today, but a patchwork of competing loyalties and jurisdictions. The 100 Years' War had fractured the country, creating a complex web of alliances and enmities that shifted with bewildering frequency. English forces occupied much of northern France, including the vital regions of Normandy and Picardy. The French court had been forced to relocate south of the Loire River, leaving the northern provinces under foreign control. Even more troubling was the civil war that had erupted within France itself. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1870 had triggered a bitter conflict between two factions of the French nobility, the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians who had allied themselves with the English. This internal strife had paralyzed French resistance and opened the door for English conquest. The situation had reached a crisis point with the death of King Charles VI in 1422. His son Charles VII was the rightful heir to the throne. but he had not been crowned and his legitimacy was disputed. The English and their Burgundian allies had proclaimed the infant Henry VI of England as the true King of France, creating a situation where two different claimants contested the French crown. For the people of Domremy, these political complexities were filtered through more immediate concerns. They were loyal to the Dauphin Charles, but they also had to navigate the practical realities of living in a border region where different authorities might assert control at any moment. The village had declared itself a sanctuary, hoping to remain neutral in the broader conflict. But neutrality was a luxury that few could afford in those turbulent times. Joan absorbed all of this, political and military intelligence, through the conversations she overheard between adults, the stories told by passing travelers, and the sermons delivered by priests who tried to make sense of the chaos engulfing their world. She learned about the siege of Orleans, the key fortress city that stood as the last major obstacle to English conquest of the Loire Valley. She heard about the military defeats that had decimated French armies and the political divisions that had weakened French resistance. But perhaps most importantly, Joan learned about the spiritual dimensions of the conflict. This was not merely a political or military struggle, but a cosmic battle between good and evil, between the righteous cause of France and the heretical claims of England. The priests taught that God would ultimately vindicate the righteous, but they also emphasized that divine intervention required human cooperation and sacrifice. This theological framework would prove crucial to Joan's later development. She came to understand the war not as a mere earthly conflict, but as a spiritual struggle in which she might have a role to play. The stories of saints who had intervened in human affairs, who had received divine visions and performed miraculous deeds, provided a template for her own understanding of what was possible as Joan grew from childhood into adolescence. These various influences, her family's faith, the village's traditions, the broader political situation, and her own spiritual inclinations, began to coalesce into something unique. She remained deeply involved in the practical life of her community, but she also began to experience what she would later describe as direct communication with the divine. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with a heightened sense of spiritual awareness, an increased frequency of prayer, and a growing conviction that she was somehow meant for something greater than the life of a peasant girl in a remote village. Joan began to spend even more time in prayer, often rising before dawn to visit the church before beginning her daily tasks. Her family noticed these changes but didn't initially find them alarming. Religious devotion was considered a virtue, and Joan's piety was seen as a reflection of her good character rather than a sign of anything unusual. Her mother, Isabel, was particularly pleased by her daughter's spiritual development, seeing it as validation of her own efforts to raise her children in the faith. But Joan's spiritual experiences were becoming more intense and more specific. She would later testify that she began to hear voices, not the inner voice of conscience that all believers recognize, but actual audible communications from specific saints. These voices, she claimed, came first from Saint Michael the Archangel, and later from Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. The content of these early communications was initially gentle and encouraging. The saints, according to Joan's later testimony, told her to be good, to attend church regularly, and to trust in God's plan for her life. They didn't immediately reveal the dramatic mission that would later define her existence, but instead seemed to be preparing her gradually for the extraordinary role she would be called to play. Joan kept these experiences largely to herself, at first uncertain how to interpret them and afraid of how others might react. She continued to participate fully in village life, helping with the harvest, attending religious festivals, and maintaining the social relationships that bound the community together. But privately, she was undergoing a profound transformation that would eventually lead her far from the quiet hills of Domremy. The village where Joan spent her childhood was about to lose its most remarkable daughter, though none of the villagers could have imagined the extraordinary destiny that awaited the quiet girl who prayed so fervently in their simple church. Domremy had given Joan her foundation, her faith, her values, and her deep love for France, but it could not contain the mission that was beginning to unfold within her young heart. As Joan approached her teenage years, the voices she heard became more insistent and more specific about what God was calling her to do. The quiet girl who had learned to listen so carefully in the church of Saint Remy was about to discover that she had been chosen to speak words that would change the course of history. Chapter 2. The 100 Years' War, a kingdom in Understand Joan of Arc's extraordinary mission. We must first comprehend the world she was born into, a world torn apart by one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in medieval history. The 100 Years' War, despite its name, actually lasted from 1337 to 1453, spanning more than a century of intermittent but devastating warfare that would fundamentally reshape both England and France. The war's origins lay in a complex web of feudal relationships, dynastic claims, and economic rivalries that had been building for decades. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, it triggered a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for both kingdoms. The French nobles, following the ancient Salic law that prohibited inheritance through the female line, chose Philip VI of Valois as the new king. However, Edward III of England, whose mother was the sister of the deceased French king, believed he had a stronger claim to the French throne. For several years, this dispute remained a diplomatic rather than military matter. But in 1337, when Philip VI confiscated Edward's extensive holdings in Gascony, the English king decided to press his claim by force. What began as a dynastic dispute would evolve into a total war that would devastate France and transform the nature of medieval warfare. The early phases of the war were characterized by stunning English victories that seemed to demonstrate the superiority of English military innovation over traditional French tactics. At the Battle of Crécy in Aix-en-Séleux, English longbowmen decimated French heavy cavalry, introducing a new era of warfare where commoners with bows could kill noble knights in armor. The victory at Crécy was followed by the English capture of Calais after an 11-month siege, giving England a permanent foothold on French soil. 10 years later, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the English achieved an even more spectacular victory, capturing King John II of France himself, along with numerous French nobles. The humiliation of having their king held prisoner in London while England demanded an enormous ransom was a devastating blow to French morale and prestige. However, the war was far from over. Under the leadership of Bertrand du Guesclin, the French began to adapt their tactics, avoiding pitched battles and instead using guerrilla warfare and sieges to slowly reclaim their territory. By 1380, the French had recovered most of their losses, and the war entered a period of relative stalemate. The conflict might have ended there, but the political situation in France became increasingly unstable. King Charles VI, who had ascended the throne in 1380, began to suffer from bouts of mental illness that left him unable to rule effectively. This created a power vacuum that two factions of the French nobility rushed to fill: the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy. The rivalry between these two factions exploded into open warfare. In 1407, when Duke John of Burgundy ordered the assassination of Louis of Orleans, this act of violence triggered a civil war within France that would prove even more destructive than the war with England. The Armagnacs and Burgundians fought each other with a ferocity that shocked contemporaries, burning cities, massacring civilians, and weakening France's ability to resist English invasion. Sensing opportunity, King Henry V of England renewed the war in 1415 with a pervasion of Normandy. The English army, though vastly outnumbered, won a crushing victory at the Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. Once again, English longbowmen proved their devastating effectiveness against French heavy cavalry, and the flower of French nobility was cut down in the mud of a French field. The victory at Agincourt was followed by a systematic conquest of Normandy that demonstrated Henry V's skill as both a military commander and an administrator. Unlike previous English campaigns, which had focused on quick raids and battles, Henry's invasion was designed to establish permanent English control over French territory. English settlers were brought in to colonize conquered lands. English law was established, and French nobles were forced to choose between exile and submission. The situation became even more dire for France when Duke Philip of Burgundy, seeking revenge for his father's assassination, formed an alliance with the English in 1419. This alliance gave the English control over much of northern France, including the vital commercial centers of Flanders and the approaches to Paris. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, represented the nadir of French fortunes. Under its terms, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the Mad King Charles VI, and was recognized as the heir to the French throne. The Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir, was disinherited and branded as illegitimate. When both Henry V and Charles VI died in 1422, the infant Henry VI was proclaimed king of both England and France, while Charles VII was mockingly referred to as the so-called king by his enemies. By the time Joan of Arc was born around 1412, France had been devastated by decades of warfare. Entire regions had been depopulated, with villages abandoned and fields left uncultivated. The population had declined dramatically due to warfare, disease, and famine. Trade networks had been disrupted, and the economy had contracted severely. The English occupied all of northern France, including the capital city of Paris. Their Burgundian allies controlled the wealthy northeastern provinces, while the French court had been forced to retreat south of the Loire River. The Dauphin Charles held court in Bourges, a city that contemporaries mockingly called the capital of the little kingdom of Berry. Perhaps most demoralizing of all was the apparent collapse of French military effectiveness. The defeats at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt had shattered the confidence of the French nobility and demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional feudal warfare. French armies seemed unable to stand against English forces, and many began to question whether God had abandoned France to its enemies. The religious dimension of the conflict was particularly important in understanding the medieval mindset. This was not merely a political or military struggle, but a cosmic battle between good and evil. Both sides claimed divine sanction for their cause, but the series of English victories seemed to suggest that God favored the English claim to the French throne. The Church itself was divided by the conflict. The Great Schism, which had seen rival popes in Rome and Avignon, had weakened papal authority and created religious confusion. Many French clerics supported the Dauphin Charles, but others, particularly in the English-occupied territories, had accepted the authority of the dual monarchy proclaimed by the Treaty of Troyes for ordinary French people. The war was experienced as an endless cycle of violence and suffering. Armies on both sides lived off the land, requisitioning supplies and provisions from peasant communities. The distinction between soldiers and brigands often disappeared entirely, as discharged soldiers formed companies of routiers who terrorized the countryside. The siege warfare that characterized much of the conflict was particularly devastating. For civilian populations, cities like Orleans, Compiègne, and Rouen endured months or even years of siege, during which the inhabitants faced starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. When cities finally fell, the inhabitants might face massacre, enslavement, or forced exile. The economic impact of the war was equally severe. The constant warfare disrupted trade networks and made long-distance commerce extremely hazardous. The heavy taxation required to fund military campaigns impoverished both peasants and townspeople, while the destruction of productive capacity made recovery difficult even during periods of peace. In the Meuse Valley, where Joan's village of Domremy was located, the war's effects were felt particularly acutely. The region was a contested borderland, claimed by both the French and the Burgundians. Raiding parties from both sides regularly swept through the area, burning villages and carrying off livestock and grain. The villagers of Domremy had attempted to maintain their neutrality, but neutrality was a luxury that few could afford. In those turbulent times, the village had been forced to build fortifications and organize a militia to defend against raiders. Children like Joan grew up hearing the sound of the alarm bell that summoned the villagers to take refuge in the fortified church when danger approached. Despite these challenges, the village had managed to maintain its loyalty to the Dauphin Charles. This loyalty was not merely political but deeply emotional and spiritual. The villagers saw Charles as their rightful king, anointed by God to rule over France. The English and their Burgundian allies were viewed as usurpers and heretics who had no legitimate claim to French soil. This political and religious education was crucial to Joan's development. She learned to see the war not as a mere political conflict but as a spiritual struggle between the forces of good and evil. The English were not simply foreign invaders but servants of Satan who sought to destroy the Christian kingdom of France. The Dauphin Charles was not merely a political leader but God's chosen instrument for the salvation of France. The stories that Joan heard in her childhood were filled with accounts of English atrocities and French martyrdom. She learned about the massacre of French prisoners at Agincourt, the brutal sieges of French cities, and the suffering of French civilians under English occupation. These stories inflamed her patriotic fervor and created a burning desire to somehow contribute to the liberation of her country. But Joan also learned about the spiritual dimensions of resistance. The priests taught that God would ultimately vindicate the righteous, but they also emphasized that divine intervention required human cooperation and sacrifice. Saints like Saint Michael the Archangel had defeated Satan in cosmic battle, but they had also inspired human warriors to fight for justice on earth. The theological framework that Joan absorbed in her childhood provided a template for understanding how a simple peasant girl might play a role in the salvation of France. If God could speak to saints, why not to ordinary believers? If divine intervention was possible, why not through the most humble and unexpected instruments? By the time Joan reached adolescence, the military situation had reached a critical point. The English were besieging Orleans, the last major fortress city, protecting the Loire Valley and the French heartland. If all Orleans fell, the road to Bourges and the complete conquest of France would be open. The Dauphin Charles was increasingly demoralized, his finances exhausted, and his military commanders divided by jealousy and defeatism. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that Joan began to experience the divine visions that would launch her extraordinary mission. The voices she heard were not abstract spiritual communications, but specific military and political instructions from Saint Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. These saints, she claimed, had told her that she was chosen by God to save France, to lift the siege of Orleans, and to escort the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. The timing of these revelations was not coincidental. Joan had been prepared, by her upbringing, her education, and her spiritual development to understand the cosmic significance of the crisis facing France. She had learned to see the war through the lens of divine providence, to believe in the possibility of miraculous intervention, and to understand her own potential role in God's plan for the salvation of her country. The girl who had listened so carefully to the stories of saints and martyrs was about to discover that she had been chosen to write the next chapter in the sacred history of France. The quiet villages of Domremy had given her the foundation she needed, but the battlefield of the 100 Years' War would provide the stage for her extraordinary mission. Chapter 3: The Awakening, Divine Voices and Sacred Visions. The transformation of Joan from a devout peasant girl into the warrior saint who would alter the course of French history began not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual awakening that would fundamentally change her understanding of her place in the world. It was around 1424, when Joan was approximately 12 years old, that she first experienced what she would later describe as direct communication with the divine voices that spoke to her, with such clarity and authority that she never questioned their authenticity. The first voice Joan heard was that of Saint Michael the Archangel, the great warrior of heaven, who had defeated Satan in the cosmic battle described in the book of Revelation. According to Joan's later testimony, Saint Michael appeared to her in her father's garden on a summer day, surrounded by a brilliant light that seemed to emanate from his very being. The vision was so overwhelming that Joan was initially paralyzed with fear, but the saint's voice was gentle and reassuring. "Joan," Saint Michael told her, "you must be a good girl and go often to church." These first words were simple, even mundane, but they carried with them a weight of divine authority that Joan recognized immediately. This was not her imagination or wishful thinking, but a genuine encounter with the supernatural realm. The appearance of Saint Michael was followed by visits from two female saints who would become Joan's constant companions throughout her mission, Saint Margaret of Antioch and Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Both were virgin martyrs who had suffered persecution for their faith, and both were renowned for their courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Saint Margaret of Antioch had lived in the 3rd century, and was known for her steadfast refusal to renounce her Christian faith despite torture and imprisonment. According to legend, she had been swallowed by a dragon but had burst from its belly by making the sign of the cross, making her a powerful symbol of triumph over evil. Her feast day was July 20th, and she was particularly venerated in France as a protector of peasants and a patron of women in childbirth. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was an even more extraordinary figure, a learned woman who had debated with the greatest philosophers of her age and had converted them to Christianity through the power of her arguments. She was said to have been tortured on a spiked wheel which broke apart at her touch before being beheaded for her faith. She was the patron saint of scholars, theologians, and anyone who used their intellect in service of God. The choice of these particular saints as Joan's heavenly advisors was deeply significant. Saint Michael represented the warrior aspect of her future mission, the military campaigns that would drive the English from French soil. Saint Margaret embodied the triumph of faith over seemingly impossible odds, while Saint Catherine represented the intellectual and spiritual authority that would enable Joan to debate with theologians and convince skeptical nobles of the authenticity of her divine mandate. Initially, the messages Joan received from her saints were simple and encouraging. They urged her to be virtuous, to attend church regularly, and to trust in God's plan for her life. But as the months passed, the communications became more specific and more urgent. The saints began to speak to Joan about the dire situation facing France and her role in the country's salvation. The voices came to Joan most often when she was alone in the garden, in the church, or in the fields around Domremy. They spoke to her in French, not in Latin, and their tone was always kind and reassuring, though increasingly urgent about the mission they were preparing her to undertake. Joan would later testify that she heard these voices more clearly than she heard human voices, and that they were accompanied by a brilliant light that made ordinary daylight seem dim by comparison. What made Joan's experience particularly remarkable was not just the content of the visions, but their consistency and detail. The saints provided her with specific information about current events, military situations, and political developments that a peasant girl from Domremy could not have known through ordinary means. They told her about the siege of Orleans, about the Dauphin's desperate situation, and about the specific actions she would need to take to fulfill her divine mission. The saints also began to prepare Joan for the incredible challenges she would face. They warned her that she would encounter skepticism, hostility, and even accusations of heresy from those who could not accept that God might speak through such an unlikely messenger. They told her that she would need to be strong, courageous, and utterly faithful to her divine calling, even when faced with torture and death. Perhaps most importantly, the saints gave Joan a detailed understanding of her mission that went far beyond the simple military objectives that would later make her famous. She was not merely to lift the siege of Orleans, though that would be her first task. She was to escort the Dauphin to Reims Cathedral for his coronation as King of France, thereby restoring the legitimate monarchy and re-establishing the divine order that had been disrupted by the English invasion. But even this was not the ultimate goal. Joan understood that her mission was fundamentally spiritual in nature, to demonstrate God's favor for France and to inspire the French people to resist their enemies with renewed faith and courage. She was to be a living sign of divine intervention, proof that God had not abandoned France to its enemies. The psychological impact of these visions on Joan was profound. The quiet, devout girl who had previously been content with the simple life of a peasant daughter was transformed into someone with an unshakable sense of divine purpose. She began to see herself not as Joan the farmer's daughter, but as Joan the chosen instrument of God's will for France. This transformation was gradual but inexorable. Joan continued to participate in village life, helping with household chores and attending church services, but her family and neighbors began to notice changes in her behavior. She became even more devout, spending hours in prayer and often seeming distracted from earthly concerns. She began to speak with authority about religious matters and to display knowledge of political and military affairs that seemed beyond her humble background. The content of Joan's visions also evolved as she matured. Initially, the saints had spoken to her in general terms about being good and faithful. But as the military situation in France deteriorated, their messages became increasingly specific and urgent. They told her about the English siege of Orleans, which had begun in October 1428, and about the desperate situation of the Dauphin Charles. The siege of Orleans was indeed a critical moment in the 100 Years' War. The city was the last major fortress protecting the Loire Valley and the French heartland. If it fell, the English would have a clear path to Bourges, where the Dauphin held court, and from there to the complete conquest of France. The Dauphin's forces were demoralized, his treasury was empty, and his military commanders were divided by jealousy and defeatism. It was in this context that Joan's saints delivered their most startling command. She was to leave Domremy, travel to the Dauphin's court, and convince him to provide her with an army to lift the siege of Orleans. The very idea seemed absurd. A teenage peasant girl presuming to instruct the future King of France on military strategy. But the saints assured Joan that this was indeed God's will, and that she would be given the strength and wisdom to accomplish her mission. The saints also provided Joan with specific instructions about how to proceed. She was to travel first to the nearby town of Vauquois, where she would seek an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the garrison. Baudricourt was a supporter of the Dauphin, and the saints assured Joan that he would eventually provide her with the escort she needed to reach the royal court. Joan's initial reaction to these instructions was a mixture of awe and terror. She understood the magnitude of what was being asked of her, and she was acutely aware of her own limitations. She was young, female, and of humble birth, three characteristics that would make her mission incredibly difficult in the male-dominated hierarchical society of medieval France. But the saints continued to reassure her, promising that she would be given the strength, wisdom, and authority needed to accomplish her divine mission. They told her that God had chosen her precisely because of her humility and purity, and that her apparent weaknesses would actually become sources of strength. Her youth would demonstrate that her mission came from God rather than from human ambition. Her gender would fulfill ancient prophecies about a virgin who would save France, and her humble birth would show that God's power was not limited by earthly distinctions of rank and class. The saints also began to provide Joan with specific knowledge that would prove crucial to her mission. They told her about the Dauphin's appearance, his character, and his secret doubts about his own legitimacy. They gave her information about the military situation that would enable her to speak with authority about strategy and tactics. Most importantly, they provided her with a deep understanding of the spiritual significance of her mission that would enable her to convince theologians and nobles of the authenticity of her divine calling. As Joan's understanding of her mission deepened, she began to experience a profound sense of urgency. The saints made it clear that time was running out for France. If she did not act soon, Orleans would fall, the Dauphin would be captured or killed, and France would be lost forever. The weight of an entire kingdom's fate rested on her shoulders, and she could not afford to delay. But Joan also faced a very practical problem. How could she, a teenage peasant girl, possibly convince anyone to take her seriously? The saints had given her a mission that seemed impossible to accomplish through ordinary means. She would need to rely entirely on divine intervention and the power of faith to overcome the enormous obstacles that lay ahead. The answer, according to the saints, lay in the very impossibility of